This is the Underconsumed Knowledge podcast. Today we're talking about George Orwell's The Road to Wigan Pier, which was written in 1937. If you'd like to follow along with my book notes, they're available online at underconsumed.substack.com or at underconsumed.medium.com. George Orwell explained in 1937 the disposition of the typical so-called socialists living in England, and why it was that so many people became averse to socialism because of these people alone. Socialists were comprised of bourgeois intellectuals who had no actual affinity for the working classes, and also of working class scribblers who worked their way into the intellectual literati, but were really pretty hostile to just about everything, and it seemed like they wanted to burn everything down. Orwell asks, what is it that these people, these socialists, really want when they seem to have no love for their fellow man, or as Alfred Adler would call it, no good social feeling? Orwell suggests that for a lot of people, socialism is a way to institute control on society and to implement order amongst those who don't share common cultural values. Orwell begins the book with descriptions of working conditions for miners in industrial England, and he went to live amongst them and observe their conditions in the mines. And it was really difficult, backbreaking, sweaty work, and their living conditions were really quite bad. They went without luxuries such as sheets, which is something I think most everyone in the world today has access to. So the first part of the book explains, a lot of the facts about the working class environment for coal miners in England. It can get to be a little bit of a slog, but it's worth reading. And then the second part of the book gets to Orwell's meat on class and the economic order in England. Orwell explains that the average socialist in England didn't see what socialism would be if it was carried to its logical conclusion, which was revolutionary. So the socialist, whether he was a proletarian or a middle-class socialist, imagined the world being much like the existing one, except, maybe there would be less poverty. Orwell explains the prejudices of the different classes by pointing out how someone who was a member of the bourgeois class would sort of disdain someone who had patriotic feelings about England and would think that England would be superior to Germany or France, but that same person would harbor a feeling of superiority about their fellow Englanders in a different part of England, similar to how, people in New York or San Francisco might look down upon people that live in so-called flyover states. So he outlines how little actual commitment there is amongst the socialists to the idea of brotherhood and having love for one another. And he points to people like, George Bernard Shaw, who has a lot of hateful feelings for the lower classes. But he also points out that these same people, once they're confronted with reality, really change their opinions to be the complete opposite of what they say they are, so the typical hypocrite. He explains also, the middle-class socialists of the 1930s as being sort of a stereotypical hippie that we might think of today, someone playing ultimate frisbee and wearing rainbow sandals, going to yoga class and whatever, but then also wanting to order people about and tell them that their values are no good and that they should live life, more like we do. And as Dostoevsky points out repeatedly in his writings, if, you tell someone what to do, or if you look down on them, the typical response, regardless of what you're saying, is going to be to give you the middle finger. So if you look beyond the fact that Orwell wasn't an economist, really he's just making an argument that, maybe we got to love our fellow man a little bit more. And that's kind of, I think, a lot of his argument for socialism, although he does, go down the path of saying he thinks that the economic order is exploitation and so on and so forth in some of his other writings. Orwell's illustration of class difference points out the inherent fact that humans have values, and that's really what it is to be human. And these values, they exist, from the left to the right, whether you're part of, the conservative religious classes, or you're, part of being woke and eating vegan cheese and going to yoga class and driving a Prius. Orwell is really arguing for mutual toleration, and that's kind of what democracy is in theory about, is the idea that we can all agree to live together and tolerate one another. So that's my initial synopsis of the book. I'm going to dig into a lot of passages that I really liked and explain why I liked them. This is one of my favorite passages from the book. Orwell talks about people's deference to authority or perceived authority. He says, "1,000 influences constantly press a working man down into a passive role. He does not act, he is acted upon. He feels himself the slave of mysterious authority and has a firm conviction that they will never allow him to do this, that, and the other. Once when I was hop picking, I asked the sweated pickers, they earned something under 6 pence an hour, why they did not form a union. I was told immediately that they would never allow it. Who were they? I asked. Nobody seemed to know, but evidently they were omnipotent. A person of bourgeois origin goes through life with some expectation of getting what he wants. Educated people tend to come to the front. Their education is generally quite useless in itself, but they are accustomed to a certain amount of deference and consequently have the cheek necessary to a commander. That they will come to the front seems to be taken for granted. So a lot of what someone does has to do with their expectations and also where they envision themselves in the society. Whether or not someone is really willing to try and buck authority has less to do with being educated and more to do with mindset and how you think about things. And this parallels some of the points made by Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers about children who come to the front and insert themselves in situations that will further their interests. So Orwell does a good job pointing out this sort of phantom deference to authority. In another passage, he says, "Talking once with a miner, I asked him when the housing shortage first became acute in his district. He answered, when we were told about it, meaning that till recently people's standards were so low that they took almost any degree of overcrowding for granted. He added that when he was a child, his family had slept 11 in a room and had thought nothing of it, and that later, when he was grown up, he and his wife had lived in one of the old-style back-to-back houses in which you not only had to walk a couple hundred yards to the lavatory, but often had to wait in a queue when you got there, the lavatory being shared by 36 people." I think this is an interesting observation and is interesting to contrast with modern day conditions where there's always this affordable housing shortage. Orwell points out that people were willing to live in conditions that were really, really quite bad, but that they didn't really think much about it. So-called affordable housing shortages really are relative and have a lot to do with people's values and how many people they're willing to sleep in a room and what they're willing to do to get through life. On efforts to try to alleviate these conditions, Orwell makes some premonitions of a book like Chris Arnade's, I don't know how to say his name, Dignity, which is a more recent book about the shelling out of middle America and communities of people that have sort of been left behind. Orwell says about the public housing buildings, they're definitely fine buildings, but there's something ruthless and soulless about the whole business. Take, for instance, the restrictions with which you are burdened in a corporation house. You are not allowed to keep your house and garden as you want them. In some estates, there is even a regulation that every garden must have the same kind of hedge. You are not allowed to keep poultry or pigeon. The Yorkshire miners are fond of keeping homer pigeons. So you can take the help, but it's a bargain with the devil, where you can no longer determine how your life is lived to an extent. And that's something that, continues to this day with various forms of social help, whether it's large, socialized, affordable housing units for, 55 and up that really look like buildings that are out of a Soviet Russia, or, it's restrictions on what you can and can't do in a homeless shelter. Ultimately, people want their human dignity to be respected, and a lot of the times, if there's social help available from nonprofits or the government, and they're not allowed to do what they want, they might just turn up that help and opt to go without it. Orwell talks about the time he spent with the miners, who were of the working class, when he was of the bourgeois class, even though he was, a low-income bourgeois class member. He says, "I cannot end this chapter without remarking on the extraordinary courtesy and good nature with which I was received everywhere. I did not go alone. I always had some local friend among the unemployed to show me round. But even so, it is an impertinence to go poking into strangers' houses and asking to see the cracks in the bedroom wall. Yet everyone was astonishingly patient and seemed to understand almost without explanation why I was questioning them and what I wanted to see. If any unauthorized person walked into my house and began asking me whether the roof leaked and whether I was much troubled by bugs and what I thought of my landlord, I should probably tell him to go to hell." I think this mirrors, for me, my own experiences of traveling in places like the Midwest. People are really very nice, very friendly, generally welcoming, despite, what might be depicted in mainstream media about the politics of those places, as someone who lives in California. Orwell makes a good observation about anonymity and the city. "Until you break the law, nobody will take any notice of you, and you can go to pieces as you could not possibly do in a place where you had neighbors who knew you." Orwell makes some good observations about the impact of unemployment, or at least how a lot of people feel that impact to be. He says, "You can't command the spirit of hope in which anything has got to be created with that dull evil cloud of unemployment hanging over you." He also says, "It is a deadly thing to see a skilled man running to seed year after year in utter hopeless idleness. It ought not to be impossible to give him the chance of using his hands and making furniture and so forth for his own home." I don't necessarily know what a good solution is when people lose hope, but I thought these were still interesting observations. Orwell says, "But no human being finds it easy to regard himself as a statistical unit. So long as Bert Jones across the street is still at work, Alf Smith is bound to feel himself dishonored and a failure. Hence that frightful feeling of impotence and despair, which is almost the worst evil of unemployment, far worse than any hardship, worse than the demoralization of enforced idleness." If you're a kind of person who has a growth mindset as opposed to the fixed mindset, you might not buy into these kind of characterizations of people, but I still think it's important to read these kinds of perceptions, just because there are a lot of people who feel this way. This is one of my favorite quotes from the book about food. Orwell says, "A human being is primarily a bag for putting food into. The other functions and faculties may be more godlike, but in point of time they come afterwards. A man dies and is buried, and all his words and actions are forgotten. But the food he has eaten lives after him in the sound or rotten bones of his children. I think it could be plausibly argued that changes of diet are more important than changes of dynasty or even of religion. The Great War, for instance, could never have happened if tin food had not been invented. And the history of the past 400 years in England would have been immensely different if it had not been for the introduction of root crops and various other vegetables. He continues, the ordinary human being would sooner starve than live on brown bread and raw carrots. And the peculiar evil is this, that the less money you have, the less inclined you feel to spend it on wholesome food. When you are unemployed, which is to say, when you are bored and miserable, you don't want to eat dull, wholesome food. You want something a little bit tasty. So when you have nothing else, at least you can have food you enjoy. Orwell gets into a lot of the class differences in England. He says, there exists in England a curious cult of northernness, a sort of northern snobbishness. A Yorkshire man in the south will always take care to let you know that he regards you as an inferior. The north is real life. He continues, here you have an interesting example of the northern cult. Not only are you and I and everyone else in the south of England written off as fat and sluggish, but even water, when it gets north of a certain latitude, ceases to be H2O and becomes something mystically superior. But the interest of this passage is that the writer is an extremely intelligent man of advanced opinions who would have nothing but contempt for nationalism in its ordinary form. Put to him some propositions as one Britisher is worth 3 foreigners, and he would repudiate it with horror. But when it is a question of North versus South, he is quite ready to generalize. I think these are really good observations about class difference. In the United States, you have Americans who will denounce people who are patriotic, or those kinds of people who think there are too many immigrants coming and taking the jobs. But those same Americans, the citizens of the world, are really just as prejudiced against the non-multiculturalists. You don't see woke hipsters looking to saddle up with a can of Bud and watch some NASCAR and go to church on Sunday. They think that they're better, that their values are better, that everyone should go get an education, stop living in Indiana, and take part in the meritocracy. So each class of society has prejudice, and it just takes different forms. And there's an inherently antagonistic relationship between the classes because each thinks its way of living is the right way, and they think they have a monopoly on truth with a capital T. And in democracy, we say that you're free to determine how to live for yourself. Orwell says, to be working class, the notion of staying at school till you are nearly grown up seems merely contemptible and unmanly. There is much in the middle class life that looks sickly and debilitating when you see it from a working class angle. So he does a good job here of observing the two different approaches to life, living in education versus, going to work and supporting yourself. He continues, this scene is still reduplicated in a majority of English homes. Its happiness depends mainly upon one question, whether father is in work. But notice the picture I have called up of a working class family sitting round the coal fire belongs only to our own moment and cannot belong either to the future or the past. Skip forward 200 years into the Utopian future, in that age when there is no manual labor and everyone is educated. The furniture will be made of rubber, glass, and steel. If there are still such things as evening papers, there will certainly be no racing news in them, for gambling will be meaningless in a world where there is no poverty, and the horse will have vanished from the face of the earth. Dogs, too, will have been suppressed on grounds of hygiene, and there won't be so many children either if the birth controllers have their way. Curiously enough, it is not the triumphs of modern engineering nor the radio, but the memory of working-class interiors that reminds me that our age has not been altogether a bad one to live in. So Orwell points out that everything that defines happiness and meaning in life for the working classes is what the classes of so-called progress want to kill. And this is something that David Foster Wallace points out. Really, what a lot of progressives are saying to the more traditional classes is that your life has no value, your life is meaningless. Orwell says, "To me in my early boyhood, to nearly all children of families like mine, common people seemed almost subhuman. They had coarse faces, hideous accents, and gross manners. They hated everyone who was not like themselves, and if they got half a chance, they would insult you in brutal ways. That was our view of them, and though it was false, it was understandable. For one must remember that before the war, there was much more overt class hatred in England. In those days, you were likely to be insulted simply for looking like a member of the upper classes. The time when it was impossible for a well-dressed person to walk through a slum street without being hooted at." He continues, "If you treat people as the English working class have been treated during the past 2 centuries, you must expect them to resent it. On the other hand, the children of shabby genteel families could not be blamed if they grew up with a hatred of the working class, typified for them by prowling gangs." I've dwelt on these subjects because they are vitally important. To get rid of class distinctions, you have got to start by understanding how one class appears when seen through the eyes of another. Snobbishness is bound up with a species of idealism. This reminds me of a quote from Gramsci scholar Antonio Santucci in a book I read about Gramsci, and in an introduction, it explained how Santucci was at some conference or another, and he said something along the lines of, "It's been said that, you have to walk a mile in a man's shoes to really understand him," and that he tried to live his life that way for a while, but that eventually he determined that the other man's shoes were just so smelly and awful that he just would rather be unjust than to have to live life trying to see things through those smelly, awful shoes. Continuing on the class antagonism, Orwell says, "Suggests to the average unthinking person of gentle birth who is struggling to keep up appearances on 400 or 500 a year that he is a member of an exploiting parasite class, and he will think you are mad. In his eyes, the workers are not a submerged race of slaves. They are a sinister flood creeping upwards to engulf himself and his friends and his family, and to sweep all culture and all decency out of existence. Hence that queer, watchful anxiety lest the working class shall grow too prosperous. For miners to buy a motor car, even one car between 4 or 5 of them, is a monstrosity, a sort of crime against nature." So the poor man of middle-class origin fears for the middle class because the working classes just want to sweep away everything that's dear to them, their meaningless learning and their culture. Orwell says, "Look at any bourgeois socialist. He idealizes the proletariat, but it is remarkable how little his habits resemble theirs. Perhaps once, out of sheer bravado, he has sat indoors with his cap on, or even drank his tea out of the saucer. I have listened by the hour to the bourgeois socialist tirades against their own class, and yet never, not even once, have I met one who had picked up proletarian table manners. Why should a man who thinks all virtue resides in the proletariat still take such pains to drink his soup silently? It can only be because in his heart he feels that proletarian manners are disgusting. So you see, he is still responding to the training of his childhood when he was taught to hate, fear, and despise the working class." Orwell makes some good observations about militarism, and this having taken place before World War II, but after World War I. He said, "In the war, the young had been sacrificed and the old had behaved in a way which, even at this distance of time, is horrible to contemplate. They had been sternly patriotic in safe places, while their sons went down like swaths of hay before the German machine guns. Moreover, the war had been conducted mainly by old men. By 1918, everyone under 40 was in a bad temper with his elders. A general revolt against orthodoxy and authority. The dominance of old men was held to be responsible for every evil known to humanity, and every accepted institution was derided mainly because old men were in favor of it. For several years, it was all the fashion to be a bolshie. England was full of half-baked antinomian opinions. Pacifism, internationalism, humanitarianism of all kinds, feminism, free love, divorce reform, atheism, birth control. Things like these were getting a better hearing than they would get in normal times. At that time, we all thought of ourselves as enlightened creatures of a new age, casting off the orthodoxy that had been forced upon us by those detested old men. We retained basically the snobbish outlook of our class. We took it for granted that we would continue to draw our dividends or tumble into soft jobs, but also it seemed natural to us to be against the government. So you see the ebb and flow here of the left to the right and back, and the lack of an actual genuine revolutionary spirit amongst the so-thought progressive classes. And Orwell talks about his own influence and class bias as a member of society, of the writing class, as a protector of the 1%, but a disdainer of the 90%. And he says, so to the shock absorbers of the bourgeoisie, such as myself, common people still appeared brutal and repulsive. Looking back upon that period, I seem to have spent half the time in denouncing the capitalist system and the other half in raging over the insolence of bus conductors. Orwell makes a pithy remark on his smelling the sweat of other soldiers when he was in Catalonia. All I knew was that it was lower class sweat that I was smelling, and the thought of it made me sick. He makes more observations about foreign occupation as he went to colonial Burma as a member of the British Empire. He says, no modern man in his heart of hearts believes that it is right to invade a foreign country and hold the population down by force. Foreign oppression is a much more obvious, understandable evil than economic oppression. People who live on unearned dividends without a single qualm of conscience see clearly enough that it is wrong to go and lord it in a foreign country where you are not wanted. The result is that every Anglo-Indian is haunted by a sense of guilt. All over India, there are Englishmen who secretly loathe the system of which they are a part. On the inhumanity of prisons and capital punishment, I had begun to have an indescribable loathing of the whole machinery of so-called justice. It needs very insensitive people to administer it. The wretched prisoners squatting in their reeking cages of the lockups, the women and children howling when their menfolk were led away under arrest. Things like these are beyond bearing when you are in any way directly responsible for them. I watched a man hanged once. It seemed to me worse than 1,000 murders. The worst criminal who ever walked is morally superior to a hanging judge. Orwell makes a good observation about his youthful romanticism and idealism, saying, I worked out an anarchist theory that all government is evil, that the punishment always does more harm than the crime, and that people can be trusted to behave decently if only you will let them alone. This, of course, was sentimental nonsense. I see now, as I did not see then, that it is always necessary to protect peaceful people from violence. In any state of society where crime can be profitable, you have got to have a harsh criminal law and administer it ruthlessly. The alternative is Al Capone. But the feeling that punishment is evil arises inescapably in those who have to administer it. He continues, I had reduced everything to the simple theory that the oppressed are always right and the oppressors are always wrong. A mistaken theory, but the natural result of being one of the oppressors yourself. I had carried my hatred of oppression to extraordinary lengths. At that time, failure seemed to me to be the only virtue. Every suspicion of self-advancement, even to succeed in life, to the extent of making a few hundreds a year, seemed to me spiritually ugly, a species of bullying. I think these are good observations about the nature of dichotomous thinking and a lack of critical thinking that can often be the case when it comes to putting the world into buckets of us and them. On the inescapable nature of class difference, Orwell echoes Dostoevsky in his 1860 book, Notes from a Dead House. Orwell says, "I washed at the kitchen sink. I shared bedrooms with minors, drank beer with them, played darts with them, talked to them by the hour together. But though I was among them, and I hope and trust they did not find me a nuisance, I was not one of them, and they knew it even better than I did. However much you like them, however interesting you find their conversation, there is always that accursed itch of class difference. It is not a question of dislike or distaste, only of difference, but it is enough to make real intimacy impossible. I found that it needed tactful maneuverings to prevent them from calling me sir, and all of them softened their northern accents for my benefit. I liked them and hoped they liked me, but I went among them as a foreigner, and both of us were aware of it." This might be slightly more applicable in somewhere like England or Tsarist Russia, but I still think that this applies somewhat in the United States, where there really is that accursed itch of class difference, so to speak. Orwell makes some really great observations in the book about sentimentalism. He writes here about John Galsworthy and sentimentalism versus reality. "But is it so certain that he really wants it overthrown? On the contrary, in his fight against an immovable tyranny, he is upheld by the consciousness that it is immovable. When things happen unexpectedly and the world order which he has known begins to crumble, he feels somewhat differently about it. This is the inevitable fate of the sentimentalist. All his opinions change into their opposites at the first brush of reality." Orwell makes another mention of this similar opinion later in the book, saying, "The opinions of the sentimentalist change into their opposites at the first touch of reality." So again, you have what you say versus what you do. And this culminates for Orwell in the ultimate question. "For in the last resort, the only important question is, do you want the British Empire to hold together or do you want it to disintegrate? The answer for man, maybe most at that time, is no, that the status quo is fine." Orwell continues, "The alternative is to throw the empire overboard and reduce England to a cold and unimportant little island where we should all have to work very hard and live mainly on herrings and potatoes. That is the very last thing that any left-winger wants. Yet the left-winger continues to feel that he has no moral responsibility for imperialism. He is perfectly ready to accept the products of empire and to save his soul by sneering at the people who hold the empire together." Orwell again makes an observation about action versus words, saying, "Hence the temptation to believe that class differences, can be shouted out of existence with a few scoutmasterish bellows of goodwill. Let's pal up and get our shoulders to the wheel and remember that we're all equal." He says, "For me to get outside the class bracket, I have got to suppress not merely my private snobbishness, but most of my other tastes and prejudices as well. I've got to alter myself so completely that at the end I should hardly be recognizable." Again, people have standards, and that's kind of part of what it is to be human. "For it is not easy to crash your way into the literary intelligentsia if you happen to be a decent human being, being the life and soul of cocktail parties and kissing the bums of verminous little lions." This is a little bit of a recollection for me of the Gandhi quote about the hardness of heart of the educated. "I have pointed out that the left-wing opinions of the average intellectual are mainly spurious. From pure imitativeness, he jeers at things which in fact he believes in. It is only when you meet someone of a different culture from yourself that you begin to realize what your own beliefs really are. This, at any rate, is what he says. The bourgeoisie are dead, a favorite word of abuse nowadays, and very effective because meaningless. Bourgeois culture is bankrupt, bourgeois values are despicable, and so on. Orwell touches again on what you say versus what you do, and how it pertains to class barriers. If you secretly think of yourself as a gentleman, and as such the superior of the greengrocer's errand boy, it is far better to say so than to tell lies about it. Ultimately, you've got to drop your snobbishness, but it is fatal to pretend to drop it before you are really ready to do so. Orwell touches on how people get lost from their common humanity and their lack of social feeling. Any socialist, he probably felt, could be counted on to have something eccentric about him. I have here a prospectus from another summer school which states its terms per week and then asks me to say whether my diet is ordinary or vegetarian. They take it for granted, you see, that it is necessary to ask this question. This kind of thing is by itself sufficient to alienate plenty of decent people. And their instinct is perfectly sound, for the food crank is by definition a person willing to cut himself off from human society in hopes of adding 5 years onto the life of his carcass. That is, a person but out of touch with common humanity. So while this was written in the 1930s and before the advent of mass-produced meat, it still rings true that there is a sort of lack of common humanity when it comes to sort of this food shaming that exists for anyone who enjoys eating meat. For anyone who's ever tried to read something like Simone de Beauvoir, this might ring true. You can see the same tendency in socialist literature, which, even when it is not openly written de haut en bas, is always completely removed from the working class in idiom and manner of thought. As for the technical jargon of the communists, it is as far removed from the common speech as the language of a mathematical textbook. No genuine working man grasps the deeper implications of socialism. Often, in my opinion, he is a truer socialist than the orthodox Marxist, because he does remember what the other so often forgets, that socialism means justice and common decency. His vision of the socialist future is a vision of present society with the worst abuses left out, and with interest centering around the same things as at present: family life, the pub, football, and local politics. Roman Catholics in England, who are obviously not the dominant religion there, that would be the Anglicans. He says, one of the analogies between communism and Roman Catholicism is that only the educated are completely orthodox. The most immediately striking thing about the English Roman Catholics, I don't mean the real Catholics, I mean the converts, is their intense self-consciousness. Apparently, they never think, certainly they never write, about anything but the fact that they are Roman Catholics. This single fact and the self-praise resulting from it form the entire stock and trade of the Catholic literary man. But the really interesting thing about these people is the way in which they have worked out the supposed implications of orthodoxy until the tiniest details of life are involved. Even the liquids you drink, apparently, can be orthodox or heretical, hence the campaigns against tea and in favor of beer. Tea drinking is pagan, while beer drinking is Christian, and coffee is the Puritans' opium. What I am interested in here is the attitude of mind that can make even food and drink an occasion for religious intolerance. A working-class Catholic would never be so absurdly consistent as that. He does not spend his time in brooding on the fact that he is a Roman Catholic, and he is not particularly conscious of being different from his non-Catholic neighbors. Tell an Irish dock laborer in the slums of Liverpool that his cup of tea is pagan, and he will call you a fool. It is only the educated man, especially the literary man, who knows how to be a bigot. I don't think that is necessarily true, that the only person who knows how to be a bigot is the educated man. But he makes some excellent points here, I think, about orthodoxy. And this is something that Glenn Greenwald, a student of Orwell, talks about a lot. And this is something that is mentioned also by Dostoevsky, this sort of portrayal of everything into this image of who you are until it permeates everything about your life, and your life just becomes a fraud, a show. You're not really living anymore. You're just going around creating this show of who you are and, wow, how great I am. With this quote, Orwell touches on what he thinks is the real problem with the supposed socialists. And he says, the underlying motive of many socialists, I believe, is simply a hypertrophied sense of order. The present state of affairs offends them not because it causes misery, still less because it makes freedom impossible, but because it is untidy. What they desire, basically, is to reduce the world to something resembling a chessboard. Take the plays of a lifelong socialist like Shaw. How much understanding or even awareness of working-class life do they display? Shaw himself declares that you can only bring a working man on the stage as an object of compassion. At best, his attitude to the working class is the sniggering Punch attitude, that of Punch and Judy. He finds them merely contemptible and disgusting. Poverty, and what is more, the habits of mind created by poverty, are something to be abolished from above, by violence if necessary, perhaps even if preferably by violence. Hence his worship of great men and appetite for dictatorships. And if anyone has read the Communist Manifesto, they know that it calls for violence. The truth is that to many people calling themselves socialists, revolution does not mean a movement of the masses with which they hope to associate themselves. It means a set of reforms which we, the clever ones, are going to impose upon them, the lower orders. The ordinary man may not flinch from a dictatorship of the proletariat if you offer it tactfully. Offer him a dictatorship of the prigs, and he gets ready to fight. Orwell closes his case about the dislike of socialists, saying, this then is the superficial aspect of the ordinary man's recoil from socialism. The whole thing amounts to a kind of malaise produced by dislike of individual socialists. Is it childish to be influenced by that kind of thing? Is it silly? Is it even contemptible? It is all that, but the point is that it happens, and therefore it is important to keep it in mind. I really liked this quote where Orwell repudiates someone who tells you what work is supposed to be for. And he was a writer, John Beevers, who wrote World Without Faith, which is an author and book that I am completely unfamiliar with. But he says, work, you see, is done to provide us with leisure. Leisure for what? Leisure to become more like Mr. Beevers, presumably. So this touches on the disdain for work that the so-called progressives had, and their love of the machine to replace work and those things that the working classes find meaningful. The truth is that many of the qualities we admire in human beings can only function in opposition to some kind of disaster, pain, or difficulty. So here Orwell starts to take on the utopianists who think that the infinite perfectibility of man is going to bring about the revolution of consciousness, and we will finally rid the world of all evil, and everything is going to be fantastic. The truth is that when a human being is not eating, drinking, sleeping, making love, talking, playing games, or merely lounging about, and these things will not fill up a lifetime, he needs work and usually looks for it, though he may not call it work. Above the level of a third or fourth grade moron, life has got to be lived largely in terms of effort. For man is not, as the vulgarer hedonists seem to suppose, a kind of walking stomach. He has also got a hand, an eye, and a brain. Cease to use your hands, and you have lopped off a huge chunk of your consciousness. And if we don't use them, then we start to cease to be human. The nomad who walks or rides with his baggage stowed on a camel or an ox cart may suffer every kind of discomfort, but at least he is living while he is traveling. Whereas for the passenger in an express train or a luxury liner, his journey is an interregnum, a kind of temporary death. I selected this quote and I liked it a lot simply because I use a bicycle to get places and I don't have a car. Orwell says, they, socialists, have never made it sufficiently clear that the essential aims of socialism are justice and liberty. With their eyes glued to economic facts, they have proceeded on the assumption that man has no soul, and explicitly or implicitly they have set up the goal of a materialistic utopia. As a result, fascism has been able to play upon every instinct that revolts against hedonism and a cheap conception of progress. It has been able to pose as the upholder of the European tradition and to appeal to Christian belief, to patriotism, and to the military virtue. So the socialists and the communists seek to dismiss all those things which, so-called normal men hold dear, and they tell them that they're not men, that they have no value, and that what they desire in their soul is wrong, or that it's false. In this quote, Orwell discusses the beehive state that could potentially be applied to something like modern-day China, saying, "It is quite easy to imagine a world society, economically collectivist, that is with the profit principle eliminated, but with all political, military, and educational power in the hands of a small caste of rulers and their bravos. That or something like it is the objective of fascism. And that, of course, is the slave state, or rather the slave world. It would probably be a stable form of society. And the chances are, considering the enormous wealth of the world if scientifically exploited, that the slaves would be well fed and contented. It is usual to speak of the fascist objective as the beehive state, which does a grave injustice to bees. A world of rabbits ruled by stoats would be more nearer the mark. It is against this beastly possibility that we have got to combine." And Orwell made clear his stance against authoritarianism and fascism in his later 1984, which was published 3 years before his death. On accepting the blessings of orthodox leaders versus actually evaluating something on its merits, Orwell made this great observation about someone who didn't like much of the Western canon, saying, "An incensed reader wrote to say, 'Dear comrade, we don't want to hear about these bourgeois writers like Shakespeare. Can't you give us something a bit more proletarian, etc., etc.' The editor's reply was simple. 'If you will turn to the index of Marx's Capital,' he wrote, 'you will find that Shakespeare is mentioned several times.' And please notice that this was enough to silence the objector. Once Shakespeare had received the benediction of Marx, he became respectable. That is the mentality that drives ordinary sensible people away from the socialist movement." Orwell wonders on his own status in society as a relatively poor writer. He says, "Economically, I belong to the working class. But it is almost impossible for me to think of myself as anything but a member of the bourgeoisie. And supposing I had to take sides, whom should I side with? The upper class, which is trying to squeeze me out of existence, or the working class, whose manners are not my manners? Orwell makes a note about antagonism, saying, "But if you are constantly bullying me about my bourgeois ideology, if you give me to understand that in some subtle way I am an inferior person because I have never worked with my hands, you will only succeed in antagonizing me. For you are telling me either that I am inherently useless or that I ought to alter myself in some way that is beyond my power." This concludes my book report and analysis of The Road to Wigan Pier. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it encourages you to cultivate your social feeling, your desire for common decency and justice, and the feeling that people should be allowed to make determinations for themselves about what life is for. Thank you.